Listen, my children. Sit close, for what I am about to tell you is not a tale born from imagination alone. It is the kind of story that the wind whispers when it passes over the red dust of Ibadan, the kind that market women lower their voices to tell, the kind that mothers use to warn their daughters when jealousy begins to grow like a weed in the garden of the heart. This is the story of Ronke and Adeola, two women who were once so close that the town called them shadow and body. But greed has a way of cutting the shadow loose. They grew up side by side on Okadu Street, in a neighborhood where the zinc rooftops caught the morning sun and the smell of oji and akra floated through the air every dawn. Ronke, full name Ronke Alabich, was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it smaller. Not because she was unpleasant, but because she was so alive, so loud, so full of color that she seemed to take up more space than her body occupied. She laughed from her belly, wore her head wraps tall and bright, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the world was watching her. Adeola Fashola was quieter water, but water that ran deeper. She was the one who read books under the mango tree while the other children played 10-10. She was the one who stayed in school when money was scarce, who woke at 4 in the morning to study for her WAC when the candle was nearly finished. The town respected Ronke, but it trusted Adeola. And perhaps that difference, small as a seed, was where the trouble began. They were inseparable, nonetheless. When Adeola's mother died in their final year of secondary school, it was Ronke who plaited her hair, sat beside her at the burial, and walked her home in silence. When Ronke's first boyfriend abandoned her with a swollen belly that later ended in grief, it was Adeola who held her through the night and told her, "You are not finished. God is not finished with you." They were the kind of friends whose love was forged not in laughter alone, but in the fire of shared suffering. But the fire of suffering, if it burns long enough, can also forge something else. Envy. It was in their 28th year that a letter changed everything, or rather, that a letter changed Ronke. Adeola had applied for a visa to Canada 3 times. 3 times she had gathered her documents, paid her fees, stood in the long snaking queues at the embassy on Walter Carrington Crescent in Lagos, and waited. The first rejection came with no explanation. The second with a terse note about insufficient ties to Nigeria. The third time, Adeola had wept quietly into her pillow, but had risen the next morning, adjusted her head wrap, and begun again. She was like that, unyielding, persistent, like the cotton tree that will not bend even when the harmattan howls. The 4th application was filed with the help of a lawyer friend, a detailed letter of employment from the private school where she taught, and an invitation letter from a Nigerian-Canadian woman named Mrs. Taiwo who had agreed to be her host. Adeola had worked with careful, surgical precision. She had prayed. She had fasted. And at last, on a Tuesday morning in November, the approval came. "Ronke. Ronke, come and see." It came. It came, she had screamed, waving the printed email like a flag of victory, running barefoot across the compound where Ronke was washing clothes. Ronke had smiled. She had embraced her friend. She had ululated with her, ilulululu. And they had danced together in the courtyard until Mrs. Adeyemi from the next compound came out to ask what the noise was about. But even as Ronke danced, something dark and quiet settled into the basement of her chest. A question, cold as stone, why her and not me? You see, Ronke had her own dream. A man, a real man, not the Lagos boys who only wanted to eat and disappear, had been sending her messages on Facebook for 6 months. His name was Chukwemeka, but he went by Emmanuel, and he lived in Toronto. He was Igbo, yes, but love does not check tribe. He was also, from what she could see in his photographs, wealthy, a blue BMW in the background of one photo, a gleaming kitchen in another, a watch that caught the light like a small sun on his wrist. He had told Ronke he loved her. He had told her he wanted to meet her, to marry her, to bring her to Canada. The only problem was that Ronke had no visa. She had applied once and been rejected. She had no steady employment to show, no savings to speak of, no compelling reason the Canadian embassy could see for her to return. She was, in the language of immigration officers, a flight risk. But Adeola had a visa. And it had just arrived. When it first came to Ronke, felt like a mosquito, small, irritating, easily brushed away. She brushed it away. She prayed against it. She told herself she was not that kind of person. But temptation, as the elders say, does not announce itself with a drum. It comes quietly, dressed in the cloth of reason. She began to tell herself a story. She told herself that Adeola would understand eventually. That she would explain everything after it was done, after she was married and settled and could help Adeola come over properly. She told herself it was just borrowing, not stealing, as though destiny could be borrowed like a cooking pot. She told herself that God, who sees everything, would see her heart and understand. The lie we tell ourselves is always the most convincing. The opportunity came 2 weeks before Adeola's flight, when Adeola left her bag at Ronke's house while she went to the market. It was a small, unassuming brown bag, the kind a woman packs when she is going on a short errand and does not expect trouble. Inside it was Adeola's international passport, her newly stamped Canadian visa, her invitation letter from Mrs. Taiwo, her employment letter, and a small envelope of American dollars she had saved for the journey. Ronke sat with that bag for 45 minutes before she opened it. Her hands shook. Her heart knocked against her ribs like someone trapped inside a room. She thought of Emmanuel and his BMW. She thought of the zinc roof of her mother's house leaking when it rained. She thought of how Adeola had always had something, always been a little more prepared, a little more trusted, a little more looked upon by the world. And she let that thought be the final push. She took the passport. She took the visa. She took the dollars. She left the invitation letter behind, a mistake she would later understand to be the thread that unraveled everything, and replaced the bag on the chair as though she had never touched it. When Adeola returned from the market and could not find her documents, the panic that seized her was devastating to witness. Ronke stood beside her, helping her search, her face the perfect mask of concern. "Maybe you left them at the school," Ronke said, her voice steady as still water. "You know how you are, always forgetting things." But inside, the guilt had already begun to move through her like poison through a stream. She could not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to her own breathing and tried to remember who she had been before this moment. The plan, as Ronke had assembled it in her desperate mind, was this: she would travel on Adeola's passport. Their faces were similar enough, she told herself, both round and dark-complexioned, both with the same wide Yoruba forehead, and when she arrived in Toronto, Emmanuel would meet her, they would marry quickly, and she would regularize her status from within Canada. Simple. Clean. Surgical. She had not accounted for one thing: Adeola's passport listed her name and details, and the Canadian visa was tied to those details. Ronke's own face in the passport photo bore enough resemblance to pass a tired officer at a domestic checkpoint. But international travel was different. She had also not accounted for something else: the travel agent she had paid to arrange her flights had made an error, one of those spectacular, world-altering clerical errors that seem almost too cruel to be accidental. Instead of booking her on the Lagos-London-Toronto route, the agent had booked her on a Lagos-Amsterdam-Helsinki routing that had been tagged incorrectly in the system. By the time Ronke, sweating in her best Ankara and clutching a stolen passport, had cleared the first leg of her journey, she was not heading to Canada at all. She was heading to Finland. Helsinki in December is a word that a woman from Ibadan cannot fully prepare her body for. The cold that hit Ronke as she stepped out of Helsinki Vantaa Airport was not the cold of a November harmattan, not the cold of a fan in a dark room, not any cold she had a word for. It was the cold of a different god entirely, white and absolute and indifferent, like the face of a wall. She stood on the pavement in her Ankara blouse and her thin cardigan, her suitcase beside her, and she did not know where she was. She did not speak the language. She had no contact here. She had no invitation letter. She had no plan. The officers at passport control had let her through, a small miracle, or perhaps simply a sign that this story was not yet finished, but she had been flagged for a secondary interview when the details on the passport raised questions. Ronke had sat in a cold white room and answered questions in halting English, trembling, inventing. She said her name was Adeola. She said she had a conference. She said many things. What she had not said, could not say, was the truth. By nightfall she was sitting on a plastic chair in a holding area, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket that crinkled when she moved, eating a cheese sandwich she could not taste, and for the first time in her adult life, Ronke Adeola wept without shame. Not the polite weeping she had done at funerals, dabbing her eyes with the edge of her head wrap. Real weeping, the kind that comes from the bottom of a person, from the part that knows it has done something irreversible. She thought of Adeola. Of the way her friend had cried when she could not find her passport. Of the way Adeola's voice had broken on the phone. Ronke, I don't understand, it was right there, everything was right there, while Ronke had listened and offered comfort with a mouthful of stolen things. She thought of Emmanuel in Toronto, who was at that very moment perhaps looking at his phone, waiting for a message that Ronke could not send. She thought of her mother in Ibadan, who did not yet know where her daughter was. And somewhere in the long, frozen Finnish night, inside the silver blanket that made her look like something rescued from a disaster, which she was, Ronke understood what the elders meant when they said, Inya ti obie jilo ohon ti ki esi terowo, ujiri ofo. The person who wakes to take what is not theirs will wake one day to find nothing. The Finnish immigration authorities contacted the Nigerian embassy. The Nigerian embassy contacted Adeola's family. Her details were in the passport, after all. It was Adeola's auntie Busy who answered the phone in Lagos, who called Adeola, who sat down slowly on the floor of her sitting room as the story assembled itself in her mind piece by piece, like a broken pot being reconstructed in reverse. The investigation that followed was not long. The travel agent who had sold Ronke the ticket identified her. The CCTV footage from Murtala Muhammad Airport showed her, her white forehead, her tall Ankara head wrap, passing through with a passport that was not hers. Adeola, to her lasting credit, did not scream or curse. She sat with her aunt and she was quiet for a very long time. And then she said, simply, I am not surprised. I am only sad. Because Adeola had seen it. She had seen the change in Ronke's eyes in the weeks before her visa came, that particular hunger, that particular brightness that is not happiness but its cousin. She had seen it and refused to name it, because naming it would have meant choosing between her eyes and her heart, and she had chosen her heart. She had loved Ronke too well to see her clearly. Ronke was deported. She was put on a plane, a real one, going to the right place this time, and returned to Lagos. She arrived not in the arms of a wealthy husband, not in the golden light of a new country, but in the harsh fluorescent brightness of the deportation holding room at the airport, with an immigration stamp in a passport that was not hers, wearing an Ankara blouse now crumpled as a discarded thought. She sat across from two immigration officers, and she told the truth. All of it. From the moment she opened Adeola's bag to the moment she wrapped herself in the silver blanket in Helsinki. She told it steadily, without embellishment, as though the truth were a thing she had been carrying too long and simply needed to put down. The law dealt with Ronke as the law must. She faced charges. She spent weeks in discomfort before her family gathered what they could for bail. She lost things, dignity, reputation, the trust of people who had once admired her. The Facebook messages from Emmanuel, when she finally replied to tell him what had happened, were returned with silence. The blue BMW and the gleaming kitchen and the sun-catching watch faded from her imagination like a dream one cannot quite hold after waking. But the hardest thing Ronke lost was not legal or material. It was the friendship. She went to Adeola. Of course she went. Where else does a woman go when she has broken the most important thing she owns? She went on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of slow, heavier the burden afternoon when the sun seems to sit directly on the crown of your head. She knocked on the gate of Adeola's aunt's compound. She waited. And when Adeola appeared, Ronke simply fell to her knees in the red dust and said nothing. Because there was nothing that the mouth could say that the posture had not already said better. Adeola looked at her for a long time. The two women were 30 years old. They had known each other for 24 years. They had held each other's grief, sung at each other's celebrations, borrowed each other's wrappers, shared the same bowl of EBA on the nights money was thin. All of that was in Adeola's face as she looked down at her kneeling friend. "Get up," Adeola said finally. "Get up from the ground. You are not a dog." She did not forgive Ronke that day. Forgiveness of that magnitude does not arrive in a single afternoon like a parcel. It comes gradually, the way the rains come after a long dry season, first a smell in the air, then a distant rumbling, then one drop, then two, and eventually a downpour that soaks everything. It took Adeola a long time. But she began. As for the Canadian visa, the embassy, when Adeola explained the circumstances, showed a human kindness that surprised everyone. A new visa was issued, after many months of reapplication and documentation and waiting. Adeola traveled. Not in the way she had originally planned, not in the brightness of that first approval she had danced about in the courtyard, but she traveled nonetheless. Because that visa had been meant for her. Her name was on it. Her life had earned it. And destiny, as the elders know, cannot be stolen. They say in Yoruba, Amoke obodoyo. Destiny must not be deflected. What Olojima has written on your ori, your spiritual head, no human hand can erase, and no human hand can write a better version. You can covet your neighbor's path. You can stand in her shoes for a moment, feel the leather of her fortune under your feet. But the shoes will not carry you where they carried her. The road knows the difference. Ronke's story is not told to shame her. She is not the first woman jealousy has devoured, and she will not be the last. Jealousy is old and patient, and it does not announce itself. It comes dressed as reasonable frustration, as righteous hunger, as the simple human wish to have what another person has. We must watch for it. We must name it before it names us. The real lesson in what happened on Okadu Street is this: Adeola's blessing was not bigger because she was luckier. It was bigger because she had worked for it with her whole self, with her 4 clock handle stubs and her 3 rejected applications and her patient, unbending faith. The visa was not paper. It was years. It was sacrifice. It was her name, written in sweat. And a thing built in sweat belongs to the one whose brow it came from. You cannot put it on your own face and make it yours. The plane took Ronke to Finland because the plane always knows where it is going. Destiny is like that plane. It will take you where you are meant to go, and nowhere else. And if you board the wrong plane, if you climb into a life that was never yours, carrying documents that carry another woman's name, you will land in a strange and freezing country with nothing but a silver blanket and the weight of what you have done. Hear, and let your own heart be still. Ohon tikoba j tire, you poda sieni to j tire. What does not belong to you will always return to who it belongs to.